Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and what you see here in front of us is some of the stuff that I'm going to be using to feed a couple of my worm bins. It's just a bunch of kitchen scraps. You can see strawberries, some cantaloupe rinds, banana peels, and a whole bunch of other stuff, including a tub full of used coffee. All stuff that the worms really enjoy. And the game plan for today is going to be to tend to some of my red wiggler bins. Yesterday I spent a little bit of time working on my red wiggler bins. And the bins that I worked on yesterday were the oldest one, which is now 140 days old, 140 days yesterday, but now 141 days old today, as well as the one that was still only 5 days old yesterday, which is now 6 days old. And what I did yesterday was I actually removed a bunch of worms out of the oldest bin to move them into my newest bin. And we're doing something along those same lines today. We're not moving worms, but we are going to be dealing with my second oldest bin to try to help encourage the movement of worms into a single spot where they can eventually get collected from. And that's really basically a reinforcement of a feeding that already occurred 6 days ago. So 6 days ago I had taken the first haul of worms out of that second oldest bin and relocated them into a worm bin. Coincidentally, my 6-day-old bin was launched off that day with those worms that I extracted. But now after 6 days of having rebuilt that feeding zone to try to encourage more and more worms to continue coming over out of the finished compost so that they could be collected, I often like to reinforce the feeding in those horizontal migration feeding zones, as I call them. So one of the bins we're tending to today is going to be the one that's already in progress with its horizontal migration, a bin from which we've already extracted worms, but we're looking to extract more and hopefully eventually depopulate the castings so that those castings could get harvested. And then I've also got a couple other bins down here. It's an 81-day-old bin as well as a 49-day-old bin. Nothing much special going on there, just everyday composting, but they're due for a feeding too after 8 days since I last fed them. So I'm going to get to work on this here. Hopefully the food that I bought down is sufficient to get this job done. I think it will be. But that's what I'm after today. So why don't we get these bins up on the bench and get to work. I thought we would start with the youngest of the bunch here. This one here is the 49-day-old bin. Not even so young anymore, at 7 weeks old. It's been coming along pretty good, but when I reviewed the video last time, I did notice that the material in the bin still kind of had some distinct signs of, clearly being, made up of paper and cardboard and leaves and stuff like that. And as time goes on, as a bin matures, it starts to look more and more like just worm castings. So I'm curious to see how it's progressing at this point after another 8 days since we last checked in on it. The leaves that you see scattered across the top are a whole bunch of autumn leaves that I had bought in not too long ago. I believe when I last reviewed the video of this bin's progress, just to refresh my memory, these leaves had a lot more color to them. They're really starting to lose their color as they gradually deteriorate. I had thought about what to use as bedding to go hand in hand with today's feeding, and it seemed to me like maybe using some of these existing leaves that are already in here might be a good idea. So I think that's exactly what we're going to do. We're probably just going to take some of these leaves and plop them down into the feeding zone, and that should help them get a little bit more attention so that they too start to break down with the rest of the food and bedding that's in here. In the beginning, they looked kind of pretty. They were sort of there for decoration almost. But, the purpose of a worm bin is a little bit more utility-minded, I think. Not so much about looking pretty. So it does seem like, after a couple weeks of having these pretty leaves in here for us to look at, it does seem like it's time for them to get fed to the worms and used as bedding material. So 8 days ago when we last came in here, we would have fed down the middle, which is kind of my typical method. Not to say that it needs to be done that way every time, but I I just seem to gravitate towards doing it that way. Once in a while I'll, switch gears a little bit and try to feed in slightly different ways. Maybe follow sort of a shifting feeding pattern, moving the feeding zone from place to place, getting the worms moving a little bit. I don't know if it really makes that big of a difference, really. So down here in the feeding zone, we've got a pretty good collection of worms hanging out, enjoying the food that was placed in here. And I see bits and pieces of what had been fed last time. I think it was pieces of apple, although I'm not sure. Maybe those go back 2 feedings. I'm also trying to see if I can spot any other traces of the previous feeding. I'm sure there's plenty of it in here. I just don't seem to be seeing it offhand, which is good. That's kind of what we want, right? We want to see the worms making good progress with the food that they're given. This bin was actually a donor for worms. I had gradually bought the population in this bin up to what I had estimated to be something in the neighborhood of about a couple thousand worms, and I had come back in here since at the time it seemed like it was the most sensible place to easily snatch a few worms for a special project I was on. So I did deplete the numbers, and I've got sort of a question mark in my tracking spreadsheet alongside this bin as well as the other bin that we're going to feed in a moment, estimating that they've probably got something in the neighborhood of about 1,200 worms, because it's really hard to say. The high number was a compilation of multiple additions of worms, and then later on came an extraction of worms. So after that much coming and going of worms, I think having a question mark next to it is a realistic way to express the number of worms in here. So we saw some of the worms that were hanging out down the middle, and I think after we include the food that we're going to give them today, we can also try to get a look at how things are progressing out on the further edges of the bin. This is not a large feeding by any means. I usually feed a lot more, but I wanted to make that little bit of food last for the 3 bins that I need to take care of today, especially the last one when I redo the feeding zone of the migration in that second oldest bin of ours. So I want to make sure I'm left with enough food at the end to take care of the job that's at hand over there. And besides that, I've got the coffee that I just added too, and I'm going to give a little grit. I don't think there was any grit added during the last feeding. And since this is one of my newer bins, I do find that it's probably a good idea to include grit in their feedings, at least in the beginning. Eventually, I think that the worms do sort of spread the grit around, and I don't think it stays in their bodies. I think it gets passed through their systems, probably leaving it in various places throughout the bin as time goes on so that it could be reused by other worms. And then I worry less about making sure that there's enough grit in the bins. But with these younger bins, I feel like it's probably a good idea to make sure that they've got grit added once in a while. So out there on the far end, we didn't see too many worms. We saw a couple hanging out here and there. Luckily, the moisture seems to be holding up pretty good. The plastic we took off in the very beginning that you saw helps ensure that the moisture within the bin is not lost to evaporation. But when we get to the next bin, you're going to notice that bin has had its plastic covering removed, and it was because I had started noticing the presence of springtails zipping around within my bins. And I think in here too, we probably saw it, but we didn't think it was so extreme that we felt like we had to cope with it. So here the plastic coverings did not get taken off the bin. But on the next one that we're going to feed, I did feel like the excess moisture might have been contributing to the outbreak of springtails. And we had taken off the plastic covering, and it's been that way for a couple weeks now, trying to let the bin air out a little bit, maybe dry off. And I believe that a slightly drier space is one of the things that could help reduce the number of a certain type of pests such as springtails. Although pests might not be a really good word for springtails, as I understand it, they're not really troublesome to the worms. They're good composters too. But at times you do start to get this sense that there's maybe more of them in the bin than there needs to be. I understand that they're a good contributing composter and a good helper within a worm bin, but I also like to consider my worm bins as worm bins. And when there's other stuff in there, that's fine, but I don't want it to get into any sort of an extreme situation. So I wanted to try to control their numbers. But I have talked about maybe restoring the plastic coverings on that other bin. So when we get back in there, we'll see how the material's looking. If it's managed to dry out to a nice point where it looks good, and if we also notice that the number of springtails has been reduced, then maybe we'll restore the plastic. So let's get over to that bin next and see how things are looking. All right, so now this was the bin that we saw on the little list, was the 81-day-old bin. A little bit older. As I mentioned earlier, the material in the bin has a slightly more mature appearance to it as well. The stuff is a little bit drier, right? Because there's no plastic here, so this paper on top is fairly dry, as are the leaves on the top surface. And that was done intentionally. I really wanted the bin to try to air out a little bit, to try to reduce the number of creepy crawlies that I was observing within the bin. So we're going to try to gauge whether or not we've achieved what we were after here, and whether the number of springtails within the material have been reduced to a manageable quantity. So I don't mind them being there, I just don't want to see mainly springtails zipping around when I open up my bins. And in the past I had almost always seen them almost right away, but the best place to see them was after doing sort of the initial skim off the top surface. So while the top surface is nice and damp over here, going down just a little tiny bit reveals a much more damp material. And that's usually where you find a good number of the springtails cruising around. And I can certainly see them. They're very, very small. But also, I'm noticing that even though I'm seeing them, I'm certainly not seeing them in the numbers that had made me kind of raise an eyebrow and kind of react to them in the first place. So I do feel like we've managed to kind of remedy the situation a little bit. So I'm glad to see that. And I'm wondering if it might be time to start running this bin with plastic coverings on it again. The worms definitely like a moist situation, right? They like the moisture. They're most comfortable when things are nice and damp. Things start to dry out, they'll usually start zipping around trying to find more moisture elsewhere. So let's try to get a gauge of how the previous feedings in this bin are holding up. I guess down here we're finding a large hunk of cantaloupe rind. I think this definitely goes back a number of feedings. What else was there in here? Plenty of worms. I thought I saw apple peels, right? Apple peels, I don't know. Apples in general seem to take a little bit of time in my worm bins for some reason. You would think it's the sort of thing that the worms would probably just go crazy over and eat up 1, 2, 3, but it's certainly not the case in my bins. This is actually just a piece of paper, but they're really enjoying it because something that was right above it was probably emitting all kinds of yummy juices, dumping onto that piece of paper. So I think after 8 days we've timed it quite nicely actually. I think we've come back in here at just about the right time to make sure that these worms have adequate food to keep them going, even though there's leftovers remaining in here which they can continue to enjoy right away. I always like to replenish and give the newest edition of food some time to sort of get broken down partially so that the worms can actually start getting added too. Because usually the freshly added food is not really what they're after. They're usually more interested in the stuff that's been kind of breaking down for some time, and that's usually where you're going to find most of the worms, enjoying some food that's been in there for a while. It's already broken down considerably by the microorganisms within the bin. So yeah, things look really good in this bin. I would almost have to say that this bin probably has a greater number of worms in it than the other one does. But I could be wrong. Maybe they were just hiding. So why don't we do the same thing as we did in the other bin. Just don't want to have a whole bunch of worms hitching a ride and somehow making their way out of the nice comfortable spot in the bin. I think that if we take some of this drier material that's coating the top surface and sink it down deep, it'll not only be a good sort of landing pad for the moisture that the new food that we add today emits, but it'll also suck up some of the moisture of the surrounding material too. And I think it too will help sort of drive down the overall moisture level within the bin. This here too is, you know, as pretty as these leaves still look, they've still got some nice colors to them. Perhaps because they're not as damp as the colorful leaves that we found in the other bin. Maybe that's why they're kind of holding on to their color a little bit better, but, you know, we're certainly not relying on these leaves for appearance. We're relying on them to serve as bedding and food, and I think making good use of them in this way is probably a good idea at this point. I'm sure that within the next, you know, few days, by the time we come back in here, by then I'm sure that most of these will have lost their color anyway. But we'll leave a few on the surface because they do seem to look nice still. Maybe the next time we peek in here we'll see a little splash of color, but I'm sure that won't last much longer. Let's give these guys another little dose of food. Here too, I'm not going to go overboard because I do want to make sure I keep a little bit for the replenishment of the feeding zone in the other bin that we're going to tend to. And there too, it's just trying to make sure that the migration of the worms in that bin continues and that the food supply in there is ample enough to make sure that the worms continue exiting out of the finished compost and over into the feeding area so they could be extracted. So let's start moving things over, give ourselves a little peek at how things look on the outside. Very nice. I think there's 32 days difference in age between these two bins, and you could certainly tell the difference when you start poking around the outer edges. The material here looks much more like finished castings. There's clearly stuff mixed in with it, but it just looks a lot more mature than the material we saw in the other bin, which is only, you know, like I said, 32 days younger. But what a difference a month makes. All right, let's try to spread some of these leaves evenly across the top. But before we close up shop over here, we'll take a peek on this side too. Here it actually looks like the material has dried off quite nicely. Or maybe not. It's hard to say. What's this, a little peach pit? We'll see how long that takes to break down. The only thing that caught my eye was it did seem like there were springtails kind of zipping around within this material over here. But here too, not, you know, not dreadful. I know that they're in the bin. I should expect to see them. But I don't think that their numbers are enough to cause alarm. So I don't think I'm going to worry too much about it. So we'll just spread things out here semi-evenly. Try to level things off. That's the way I like to leave my bins. I always find that a nice level top surface in my bins is a good way to leave it. Just in case the bin is trying to tell you something, you want to be able to tune into it and not miss any important clues. No, that's just a little splinter. I don't think I've got any worms on my glove. All right, so I think it is okay at this point to start restoring things back to the way it was a couple weeks ago, before I reacted to the springtail outbreak. And you know what? I'm trying to remember now. Do I go back and try to... Did we add coffee? I don't think we did. You know what? Oftentimes I just abandon going back and covering for missed steps, but I think we're still in a position here to include the coffee as originally planned. Because for some reason the coffee always slips my mind. That was the other reason I had, not bought so much food down here, because my aim was to use coffee hand in hand with the feeding. And I thought that the inclusion of the coffee would bring us up to a nice, plentiful amount of food in each bin. So I did not goof up on that occasion. Yesterday was funny. I fed 4 containers, and of the 4, only 2 of them got coffee, because for some reason it just slipped my mind. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just too busy gabbing. Gotta focus a little bit. Alright, things look nice in here. I think if we do restore plastic to cover things up here, then the color of these leaves will probably begin fading. So this is kind of how we found it, but I think what I'm going to do now is return what had been. I'm pretty sure that this is what had been covering things here previously. It's a piece of cardboard, and it's coated in plastic, so it kind of integrates the plastic covering with the cardboard covering too. So we'll see how things progress. If things still look like they're overly damp in here, we can always undo what we just did. But at this point, we're kind of sticking to my norm, which is to typically use plastic to try to keep the moisture within the bin. All right, so now we've got one more bin to check in on. So let's get that one out here. So now here, within my second oldest red wiggler bin, 104 days old of age, no, 105 days old. We've had 6 days of worms migrating towards the rebuilt feeding zone. The reason it was rebuilt was because we'd already gone through one extraction of worms to migrate them out of here, which we've already talked about before. I'm just repeating myself at this point, which is not uncommon. I think the last time we looked at this paper, we had contemplated replacing it at some point soon. Doesn't seem that bad, though. It seems like we could probably still keep going with it a little while longer. Seems like after 6 days, this piece of cardboard is still holding up, which is kind of nice. And for what we're doing today, this horizontal migration feeding zone, is attempting to lure worms out of this side of the bin. This side of the bin is what I'm deeming as finished castings at this point. So I think before we take care of replenishing food, one of the things I like to do sometimes is to try to skim off a lot of this dry material on the top. And it's not so much the dry castings themselves that I'm interested, but it's all these little sticks and stems that are not going to get any attention at all out here on the surface, especially since they're so dry. So it seems sensible to try to put them in a place where they at least have a little bit of a chance of maybe getting broken down a little bit further. Over in the feeding zone, over there where the plastic is covering things up and there's more moisture, much more worm activity. That's one thing I like to do usually, because otherwise the stuff will just sit there and go nowhere, right? But before we replenish the food that's in the feeding zone, why don't we take a quick peek at how the depopulation of this material is progressing. It was 12 days initially before we took out that first haul of worms, and then 6 days since then that we replenished the food in there to try to encourage the remainder of the worms to come out of this material. This material is definitely nice and loose and dry, getting drier and drier every day. By design, you know. It's the reason it's not covered with plastic, it's covered only with paper. Pretty tattered piece of paper. And I really like what I'm seeing here. The dryness of the material, I'm sure, had a lot to do with the worms probably starting to feel like they want to find themselves a much more comfortable, more damp place to be. Because up until now, I've really not even seen one worm so far. And I think at this point we've pretty much explored about half of the finished compost already, starting all the way back here at the furthest from the feeding area. So this is really promising. I wonder if we may have already accomplished what we were after here. I wonder if it could be that maybe there's no need to replenish the feeding zone. Maybe the worms have already moved out of this finished compost. This is looking really good. I always expect to find more and more worms as we make our way closer to the feeding area. But now we're coming right down through the middle and still not a worm. Oh, just a little stick rolling around. I thought I saw a worm moving. Wow, how do you like that? This could be kind of a record-setting migration for me. 12 days plus 6 days, 18 days, so not even 3 weeks. And it looks like we've more or less depopulated our castings. Here's the first worm that I've spotted. It's kind of a juvenile. Maybe he just doesn't have the wits about him to try to find a more comfortable place to be, where there's moisture and food and all of his friends and family. So here's another one. It does seem that as we make our way closer to the feeding area, we are now finally encountering a worm or two. But I mean, we've definitely gone through, I would have to say, at least 2/3 of the finished compost in this tub. And there's really not much left for these little guys to do in terms of evacuating the finished material. I think between allowing this material to be foraged heavily before I start this migration process, meaning no feedings, you know, just let them pick away at any little residual bits and pieces that might still be within the material, which I allowed it to go for weeks and weeks. And then, after that time, you start feeding on one edge. They're hungry by that time, and they're heavily motivated to go looking for a fresh food supply. Wow, look at this. This is so cool. They, how do you like that? I think we're done here. I really think we are. I don't think this food that we brought down is going to be needed whatsoever. I'm sure that whatever's over there is probably sufficient to keep the worms that have made their way over there happy. At this point, I'm kind of just going right to the divider cardboard, which isn't really meant to be a partition or an obstacle or anything like that. It's really just for me to see where the finished castings were and where it is that I had set up the migration feeding zone. Even right here on the very, very perimeter, I'm seeing hardly a worm. I mean, right there's 2 of them hanging out. Let's put them where they belong. But you know what? I think you'll agree with me. This migration is complete. These castings are ready to be harvested. And that's the beauty of doing it this way, because harvesting equates to doing nothing more than simply scooping the castings out of the tub and then finding the worms a new place to be. Wow, how do you like that? So, that's really awesome. It's not what I was expecting, not what I was expecting at all. So, I mean, what do? Do I switch gears? Do I just do an extraction of worms and then call it a day? It seems like a good thing to do, right? At this point, I would just, take everything from here and move everything. Move them right into their new home. So, why don't we do that? There's not much to it. It's just a matter of scooping out what's here and releasing the worms, placing them into their new home. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and return some of that food that I bought down here. This is surplus at this point. I'm going to plop that right back into the freezer and get a little bit cleaned up and rearrange things so that we can proceed with extraction and release of these worms. That's awesome. So this is the container that I had the food in, but I've now taken the food back to the freezer and we're going to use it to pull worms out. This is awesome. All right, it's nothing more than simply scooping, right? So let's get these guys out of here. I wonder how much food is remaining after 6 days since we last rebuilt this feeding area. I'm also curious to see how many worms we managed to collect. Sometimes I'll try to pick a lot of this stuff out and return it to the active bin into the feeding zone, but at this point all this bedding and food scraps, everything that's in here is going with the worms into their new home. This is just some of these larger strips of paper that are sort of making it a little bit more difficult to pull this stuff out of here. This feels like there might be a greater number of worms in it. There's quite a few. Just don't want to run out of room in here. Let's just make sure we're keeping all this stuff over here. I guess it's not the end of the world if my castings have a few worms lingering within them. I mean, it is dry, but not so deadly dry that the worms would be in any danger by staying in the castings. Alright, we're definitely running out of room here, but that last handful had quite a number of worms in it. Very cool. Alright, let's just see what we can do in terms of trying not to leave any wormies behind. Pretty cool. I guess this can probably go with the worms too. It would be probably good bedding to include. Okay. Try to get most of them, but it's probably not the end of the world if a couple of them stay within my castings. So this definitely got some good weight to it, but I also know that it's not worms only. It's a mix of a bunch of other stuff too. A whole bunch of bedding material, probably some leftover food. So even though we did something very similar to this yesterday, pulling worms out of my oldest worm bin, we're now bringing a close to my second oldest worm bin after only 105 days. All right, so it's usually at this point that I remove the sticker from the worm bin, indicating to me that it's no longer an active bin. And at some point I just pour off the castings, dump them into a bucket. Or if I just needed them right away, I could put them right into my garden or whatever it is that I plan to do with them. All right, that is awesome. So that was a pleasant surprise, I must say. I guess we can just maybe include this too and bring that over into the other bin where it will probably get a little bit more use. Maybe even that piece of paper that was covering things up in here could get used as bedding over there too. Or maybe I'll just put those things aside to use them elsewhere. At this point, I'm just interested in getting the worms released into their new home. So, very, very cool. Let's make it official. We're done. A tub full of finished castings. Quite a bit of them, too. Nice haul. All right, let's get these worms released, then we'll be done. Actually, you know, since I don't know when I'll be emptying those castings so as to not let them continue drying out maybe I will just use these to cover them up in the meantime. So here in my newest red wiggler bin, we're going to cut loose these little guys, reunite them with all of their little friends and neighbors who went before them. Seems like as time goes on, the worms start to get wise to the fact that there's a nice collection of moisture right on top of this piece of paper. Every time I come in, there's always more and more of them to be found there. Some of them aren't even patient enough to go around. They just dig right through the paper to get up there. That usually adds up to the demise of that paper covering on top, but that's exactly what it's there for. So how do you like the pretty colors? I had some leftover colorful leaves from the setup of a new time lapse that I just started a day or two ago, and I thought it might be interesting to use the residual leaves that I had bought in to throw a little splash of color here on the top surface of my newest red wiggler bin. See what a nice job that plastic covering is doing. All of these leaves that were quite dry when I bought them in from outside are nice and damp at this point, rehydrated from all the moisture that's circulating here within the bin. I'm going to set this aside and we could just place that right on top when we return that piece of paper. But I think what we're really here to take care of is the release of these little guys. This should be fun. Alright, so like as usual, it's at this point that we typically get the best view of how many worms we've managed to collect, although on this go around there's a fair bit of residual other matter in here. It's going to obscure our view of them, but maybe if we're able to see how many we've gotten here, try to come up with some sort of a rough estimate of how many worms we're releasing into here. So I'd love to hear everyone's opinion on how many we managed to round up here. Wow, this is a tall stack of material. You can see right away there's worms in there. So let's spread this out. I guess that's the end of the beautiful autumn color leaves. So we cover everything up with these little guys. And there's definitely leftover food in here of all different types. I guess 6 days just wasn't enough for even this many worms to deplete the food. So I think this will actually go in here as a feeding too of this bin. There's a banana peel. All kinds of goodies in here for these little guys. It's a good thing I've got paper and plastic and all kinds of stuff covering things here because I wouldn't want all this stuff just exposed to the air, attracting bugs. So let's give these little guys a moment or two to dive down into the bedding. Shouldn't take them long, and we'll be finished. Alright, well I've given these guys a little bit of time and I can still see a few piles of worms in here. But I think that's enough time. I think it's about time that we gave them a little bit of darkness and peace again. So maybe this piece of cardboard for now can just rest here on top, and later on maybe when we come back in here to feed next time or whatever, we'll try to make better use of that cardboard, maybe as bedding underneath a future feeding or something like that. But at this point I think we're more or less finished. We're going to cover things up the way we found them. It's funny, even though this bin did appear on that list that I showed earlier, on that little list of all my different red wiggler bins, and we didn't really expect to have anything to do with this bin today. Here we are adding more worms. I don't know about you, I would have to guess that just based on the weight, which you cannot experience unfortunately, but I would say just from the weight of that tub that everything was in, factoring in the knowledge of all that other stuff that was in there alongside the worms, all the bedding and paper and leftover food, I would still have to guess that there must have been at least 500 or 800 worms in that haul. It was very hard to see them all mixed in with that material that they were occupying, but I have to say just from the weight, probably a good 800 worms or so. So I'm going to update my spreadsheet, scratch in a number there, but I would love to hear what you think in terms of how many worms you think we just added to the population of this bin right here. I'll always factor in your input, make updates to my note-taking if need be, if it seems like my numbers and estimates were way off. So let me know what you think in the comments. How many worms do you think we just moved over here? Let's see, what else is there to do? You can already see that I've gotten a little head start on getting things cleaned up here. I've washed off my glove, and I got a couple other things to put away here, but I'm not going to bore you with that. That's boring. I'm going to end the video here. But before I do, let me just really quickly say thank you. Please remember to give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. I hope you did. And also remember, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. All right, everyone, have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.